Hello and welcome to the Hoover Institution's 2013 Fall Retreat. I'm Chris Dower, Hoover's Director of Marketing and Strategic Communications. Our speakers in this video are Terry Anderson, the John and Jean Nault Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, and Carson Bruno, a Research Fellow. The title of their talk is Fracking, Should You Fret or Fete? It was recorded on Monday, October 28th, 2013.
Well, let me welcome you to this intimate conversation with fellows. They asked Carson and me to do this, and we said fine. And then they said you'll be in the tent, so it not quite like being in a small conference room. But welcome. I'm Terry Anderson. I'm the John and Jean Nault Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. I spend 3 months here. And I come here from Montana, and everybody always says, oh, it must be January, February, March, or December, January, February. But nah, it's always March, April, and May, the worst months in Montana, when it's still snowing, sunny some days, too muddy to do anything. Fishing's horrible. There is no skiing, and here it's perfect. So I'm appreciative of the chance to be here. And I'm really appreciative of the chance to be here right now because we're expecting to get 8 inches of snow in Bozeman, Montana today. We'll go back to that. I'm also president of a research institute in Bozeman, Montana, the Property and Environment Research Center, or PERC. Our mission is to improve environmental quality using property rights and markets, and we'll chat a bit about that as Carson and I go on. I remember very vividly an opportunity in graduate school, and you may say, how could he remember anything from graduate school vividly? It's one of those great experiences, though, that happened as a professor who'd been visiting from Oxford, and I were sipping whiskey after he beat me badly in a squash match. And he said to me, young man, for the rest of your life, the great thing about your career is you'll be around the brightest and youngest minds in the world. And that is indeed the great part of being at a university and a good part of being at the Hoover Institution. And I'm fortunate to have one of those young, bright minds to work with, Carson Bruno. Carson received his undergraduate degree from Washington and Lee University and his graduate degree from Pepperdine. And last spring we hooked up to do a project examining hydraulic fracking, more affectionately known, or hydraulic fracturing, more affectionately known as fracking. And we have taken this on with the subtitle of Should We Fret or Should We Fete? Just to show you my dedication to the Hoover Institution and my fellowship here, I was pheasant hunting in North Dakota and cut my pheasant hunting a day short to come to this institution. So that's a real sacrifice. The birds didn't mind, didn't suffer anything anyway because I'm such a bad shot. But it was interesting being in North Dakota, where you just can't believe the boom that's going on. Little towns in North Dakota and even parts of eastern Montana look like Palo Alto on a Saturday night. They're bustling, probably a little rougher crowd than Palo Alto has, but nonetheless, they're bustling. That people are fully employed. The place I was hunting is a ranch that has a small lodge, and it's jam packed every day of the hunting season with people from the fracking industry who are there to get a little recreation time. Even as far west into Montana as Billings, Montana, a sort of supply point for a lot of the oil field work. It has just been a tremendous a boom to the economy. And we want to chat some about the economics of fracking and what it has meant. And then finally, we'll close after doing some of that. We'll talk a bit about the policy implications, which I think are important. But first, the young bright mind who knows more about these engineering things than I do will talk to us a bit about what fracking really is. And if we can't have a conversation with you, we're at least going to have a conversation between the two of us. So enjoy that, if you will, and we'll have time for Q&A as well. So Carson?
Thanks a lot, Terry. I'm going to take you through the technical process of hydraulic fracturing in a few minutes. It's going to be a very kind of high-level view at it all. But it's important to kind of get that foundation before we jump into the benefits, the concerns, and then the policy implications. So hydraulic fracturing has been around in the United States since the 1940s. However, due to a bunch of different technological advances, as well as some new geological exploration, such as the shale plays, it really has increased in activity over the past few recent years. The process starts with, of course, the site selection. And after site selection, there is the drilling process. And that's broken into two stages. Typically the conventional drilling, which is your vertical drilling, and then the horizontal or lateral drilling, which is the new part of it all. The drilling commences, piping is inserted, and then cement casing is inserted throughout the pipe to protect it from the rock structures surrounding it. And as you can see, the vertical line, the vertical piping, goes well below any sort of groundwater sources. And then around a quarter of a mile above the intended lateral or horizontal zone, a new drilling bit is inserted, and this one has a sensor on the tip of it, and it actually starts to drill at a downward sloping angle that then provides that horizontal drilling area. Again, piping is inserted, it's encased using a cement seal, and that drill bit is then removed. At this point in the time, it needs to be prepped for the hydraulic fracturing process. And to do so, they actually insert this little cylinder gun that is called a perforation gun. Using a very strong electrical current, it actually perforates the pipe, the cement seal around it, as well as the shale rock surrounding the pipe and cement, with very tiny little holes. They do this along the entire lateral zone of the horizontal pipe and then pull out that gun. At this point is when the hydraulic fracturing actually occurs. Up until this point, it's normal drilling with a little bit of extra prep associated with it. To do the hydraulic fracturing, they plug the horizontal zone of the pipe and then inject at a very high acceleration fracturing fluid. This fluid consists of about 99% water and sand and roughly 1% of chemical additives. The idea here is to actually use the pressure of the water to poke through the perforated cracks and widen the fractures within the shale surrounding it. The water then recedes back into the pipe, but the sand and chemical additives actually keep the fracture wide, so the hydrocarbons, whether that's oil, natural gas, can flow into the pipe later on. Using a vacuum, it then pulls up the fracturing fluid, which then creates this suction effect that then the hydrocarbons start to flow into the pipe and out through the drill well head. Before, though, you get any sort of oil or natural gas coming out, you do have the remainder of the fracturing fluid, which is called flowback, and then you do have what's called produced water, which is naturally occurring water within the shale formation that has highly concentrated levels of minerals, iron, etc., that sort of stuff, as well as other hydrocarbons such as methane. Both these materials, both the produced water and the flowback, need to be disposed of properly once they come out of the drill head. And then at that point, you have a normally operating well, just like you see on TV. So that's the process in a nutshell, essentially.
Yeah, and I have a good friend who's been involved in the fracturing business for a long time and has developed some of the techniques that actually isolate where those little holes go through those pipes, and it's mind-boggling to me to just imagine how they can do that some 6,000 feet underground in many cases, and they can send these laterals out literally for miles in some cases. I want to talk just a little bit about what this has meant to energy, and the slide is entitled, "Yet Again, We Are Not Running Out of Energy." I can remember early in my graduate career reading about studies that said, we only have so many years of reserves of oil, and we're going to run out at current consumption. And this story has been told and retold, and the people who write it, a guy named Lester Brown, for example, write it and rewrite it, and they always have, we only have so many years left, and if we consume at current rates, we will run out, but we never run out. And yet again, we aren't running out. You may have heard of the term peak oil. Well, peak oil hasn't peaked. And when we look around at what this means in the United States, it provides what I really appreciated Condi's introduction, really, an energy platform for the United States, Canada, and as she said, we haven't even really began thinking about what it means in Mexico because of the institutions there. The Bakken, as you can see from this slide, has tremendous amounts of oil and gas sitting there in North Dakota, oil and gas that wasn't even touched in the 90s and early 2000, and now is creating this energy boom. And that's one of the big ones. The Eagle Ford play in Texas is another, and it's just astounding to me to think that they will have more energy produced there than from Venezuela, Kuwait, Mexico, and Iraq combined. The Eagle Ford play itself is an oil nation. And of course, then there's the Marcellus. So these are scattered all around the United States. And there are some, I believe, 31 states that have potential for more development using the fracking process. And with this sort of expansion, it means we really have a potential to be as more energy independent than any of us in this room could have even begun to dream about just a few years back. And it's also something that's happening at the same time that we see it's going to continue to happen even with the current prices of oil expected to go down. Natural gas prices have plummeted themselves because of the availability of gas from places like the Bakken and the Marcellus. The estimates are that we'll have a steady supply for a lot of years out of this, again, even independent of what might happen to oil prices. Again, I won't read these to you. You can read them faster yourself. But I think what's really crucial is again Condi's point that we have an energy platform for growth, for energy independence, and all of this plays then through the economy and really through our foreign policy, because it makes the Middle East, on which we've been so dependent and indeed held hostage from time to time, it makes it much less important in terms of where we put our foreign policy resources with respect to energy, at least. So we're going to frack now because it's really a profitable thing to do. And as we do so, I think Carson chose this title, we're fracking and fetting all the way to the bank. This has just been a huge, had a huge positive impact on the economy. One can only imagine after listening to John Taylor, if we'd gotten our monetary policy right, just where we'd be with the kind of energy resources that have been made available. It employs millions of people across the country. I mentioned what it was like in North Dakota, seeing that, the trucks driving all around. My wife Monica and I drove through Wyoming this summer, the same sort of thing. It is something that economies, especially in places like parts of rural Pennsylvania and parts of North Dakota, would just have no chance of. North Dakota has one of the lowest unemployment rates in the country as a result of the fracking boom. Now, I want to digress for one moment in this fracking and fetting all the way to the bank to some work I've been doing recently on Indian reservations, because Indians aren't. This one says fretting. They are fretting and they aren't fetting, and the reason is Indian nations in this country, though they sit where they could take advantage of this, have not been able to do so. I did a paper for a conference at the Bush Institute in Dallas at SMU a month ago, and we focused in that paper, a colleague and I at PERC, on what energy potential there is on reservations. Not all of it is related to fracking, or in this case, this is a picture of the Bakken, which I'll explain in a minute. We'll just let it play as I talk. If you look at Indian reservations in the United States, we estimate that there is $1.5 trillion worth of energy resources west of the Mississippi on Indian reservations. $1.5 trillion. This is a relatively small number of people with a huge amount of energy potential, but it's not being tapped, and it's not being tapped largely because of federal policies that make it very difficult to tap those resources. One of those policies is the policy with respect to the war on coal. Darren Old Coyote, the chairman of the Crow tribe in Montana, recently spoke and said, the war on coal is a war on our families and our children. They understand that the energy potential on the Crow reservation could help lift them out of poverty. The Crow tribal wealth in coal, they have about 9 billion tons of recoverable coal. At today's prices, it makes them $3.5 million per person. That's what they could have if they could develop it. But they can't develop it because of federal policies. The same applies to oil development on reservations. I had a piece in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago dealing with the implications for Indian nations, and I have a few copies if you're interested. In northern Montana, one of the reservations has leased some oil mineral rights to a development company that wants to engage in fracking. The company went in to start the process of developing the oil and was stopped by the Bureau of Indian Affairs because it had, the BIA said, you have to do an archaeological survey. The chairman of that tribe looked out at the field and said, there are no teepee rings there. This field has been plowed for 100 years. Let's drill. They want to move forward and can't. The Bakken in North Dakota surrounds here the Fort Berthold shown in pink. This is the Fort Berthold Reservation. If you watch this slide, what you see is 1950, 1960, 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, and you can see what's happening. This is just this explosion of drilling, but you'll note that almost none of it is taking place on the Fort Berthold until the last few years. In the last few years, Congress passed a law specifically for the Fort Berthold. It was implemented by Ken Salazar, President Obama's Department of Interior Secretary. And I just received an email this morning from Ken Salazar regarding the piece that was in the Wall Street Journal, and he says, for many of them, the Indians, their energy resources are their future. I saw this firsthand in the work I did on the Fort Berthold Reservation, from 0 permits at the beginning to over 300 in 3 years to open it for oil and gas exploration. So here's another huge potential for energy development and a huge potential to lift one of the poorest elements of our country out of poverty by letting them take part in this. I could show you slides for other reservations that aren't as fortunate as the Fort Berthold. This is a case where the federal government's policies are holding back the energy development, and yet we're still doing pretty well. So a bit of an aside, and again, if you're interested in more on that, I'd be happy to provide you with a copy of the op-ed that I had in the Wall Street Journal. Finally, we want to turn to, so why are we even, with all this, you might say, well, let's all fret. What's the fret? Why all the fret? And to be sure, there are some potential environmental concerns. We'll talk about how we think they should be addressed, what policies would work. But a lot of the concerns are local, and they have to do with the water that's coming back out of these fracking wells. They have to do with the flaring of methane, which, keep in mind, is a valuable resource in and of itself. It's what natural gas is made of mainly. And so if you flare methane, it's like burning dollar bills. It's not something you want to do. But the good news is that this energy development is, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, it really is pretty clean. And furthermore, it takes up very little space. If you compare a 20-acre pad in either the Bakken or the Marcellus and the energy produced from that with alternative energy, such as wind and solar, more energy is produced from one 20-acre pad in either of those places than all of the alternative energy production from the United Kingdom, and they do a lot of it, from both windmills and solar panels. That's energy sprawl that is taking up land that could be producing food, taking up land that could be wildlife habitat, taking up land that could be housing developments. It's taking up space that does have alternative uses. Again, I'm not saying that there isn't a place for alternative energy, but most of these environmental issues that have been concerned are environmental issues that come about because of some early problems with the fracking process. And with that, let me just turn it back to Carson to talk a little bit about some of the other concerns there are in the process.
Right. So there are concerns that need to be addressed, and that's really where Terry and I are trying to go with what's the best alternatives to use to address these concerns. We are just focusing for our project on the water-related concerns. There are air quality issues that need to be addressed as well, in addition to the trucking, the congestion, and that sort of those sort of issues. But for our purposes, we're going to focus on the water-related ones. First of which is, of course, water contamination. I'm sure you've all probably seen this great theatrical moment in the recent movie Gasland, where the individual actually lights his water on fire. That is a result of high concentrations of methane in the water. Initially, people are concerned with water contamination because of the hydraulic fracturing fluid, which does contain chemicals in it. However, recent scientific studies from Duke University, from MIT, even from the EPA themselves, have found that really any sort of water contamination issues really don't stem from the fluid at all. They found little to no evidence of fluid contamination. The real issue is this idea of methane contamination. And it's really it could be the result of four different areas. Either, of course, the faulty well design, so the sealing wasn't done properly, or some sort of incident occurred where the pipe kind of broke at some particular point within the vertical or the horizontal zone. You could have the leakage or spillage of the produced water, which does contain high levels of methane. That spillage could seep into a water source at some point. It could also be the result of the man-made fractures connecting with a natural fracture within the shale and other rock beds that then connects to a groundwater source. Or it could be actually the result of actually disturbing naturally occurring methane already in the water source. And that, from scientific studies, has really been the main culprit. The fracturing process really kind of disturbs the methane that's actually at the bed of groundwater into the water source. However, as we kind of go through this, you're going to start hearing a theme. These concerns are real, but they're rare. Really, the issue at hand really isn't. This is not a widespread, consistent. Every single well is contaminating water. You really have some wells that have contaminated water quite heavily because of some sort of faulty design or one of these other things I mentioned. But for the most part, it's actually a non-issue. It really doesn't occur. It's not a problem. And individuals who live nearby wells aren't really being affected all too much.
I might just interject that a friend, after I was telling him we were working on this, said he used to go to Pennsylvania to visit some relatives, and he's my age, and he was a child then, so it was a few years back, and he said the relatives there enjoyed doing just what you see in this picture, lighting their faucet water on fire. And this has been around for a long time. A lot of this methane that's in water exists out of existing wells, and had nothing to do with the fracking process.
Yeah. Another issue is water usage. About 5 million gallons of water is used for hydraulic fracturing each well. That adds up over time between January of 2011 and September 2012. It is estimated that the hydraulic fracturing industry used roughly 66 billion gallons of water. This can be exacerbated because the majority of the fracturing does take place in the western United States, which does follow the first in time, first in right appropriation rules when it comes to their water. And also about 47% of the hydraulic fracturing takes place in what is known as high or extremely high water stress zones, that areas that have very limited fresh water resources at hand. However, it's important to put this 5 million gallons of water in perspective. It might sound a lot on the face value, but when you start to realize exactly how much water that actually is, it doesn't really sound like too much. And for instance, it is the same amount of water consumed by all of New York City in just 6 minutes, the same amount of water used to water a golf course for just 23 days. It's the same amount of water used to water only 7 acres of corn seasonally, and it's the same amount of water used annually by 40 American households for indoor uses only. So it is an issue that must be dealt with and understood, particularly in certain parts of the country like Colorado, like parts of Texas. But when you put it into perspective, it becomes, again, a real but rare issue. And then finally, we have induced seismic activity. At first glance, you're probably all thinking, well, what the hell does induced seismic activity have to do with water? The initial reaction is the fact that induced seismic activity has to do with the actual fracking process, where you're injecting a high volume amount of water into a very small space. It creates a disruption. That actually isn't the case at all. In the investigations that result from induced seismic activity in Ohio, Oklahoma, and England, what has really been the culprit has been the disposal of the produced water and the flowback. To do so, the typical process of disposing of this produced water and flowback currently is to actually inject it about 8,000 feet under the ground into sandstone pits, essentially. This protects it from leaking into other water sources. However, if the site's not chosen correctly, it can actually cause a fault slippage at that point, thus creating an induced seismic activity. However, again, you have to put this in perspective. What sort of seismic activity are we talking about? Are we talking about a Northridge earthquake? Or are we talking about a little tremor that really no one can really feel? And some great work by Arthur McGarr, who's a geologist at the U.S. Geological Survey, has actually estimated what the maximum seismic activity could be induced from hydraulic fracturing. And he determined there is a proportional relationship between the amount of water disposed and the magnitude of an earthquake. And the maximum level is a 3.7 magnitude, which, according to the Geological Survey, is, quote unquote, would be felt only by a person at rest, especially on the upper floors of the building. Many people wouldn't recognize it as an earthquake. Standing cars might rock slightly, similar to a passing truck. And the Michigan Technological University classifies a 3.7 magnitude as a minor earthquake, which, quote unquote, is often felt but only causes minor damage. And they estimate about 30,000 of these level earthquakes happen annually in the United States. And again, this is a maximum, according to Arthur McGraw. It can range from 0 all the way up to the 3.7. So again, for those of us in California, that isn't really a big issue. For someone in Oklahoma or Ohio that's never felt an earthquake in their entire life, they might get a little bit startled by that. But really, most of the earthquakes that occur really have minor damage at all. So again, it's a rare but a real problem. So how are these issues currently dealt with? As Terry mentioned, there are about 31 states that have actual or potential development. These 31 states all deal with hydraulic fracturing in very different variations of ways. And that's really a factor because there's limited federal oversight within the hydraulic fracturing realm. The water-related regulatory systems tend to be all command and control, so setting very clear standards, very strict rules about where a site can be placed, very quantitative sort of commands, and or permitting. They use the permitting system to kind of influence what happens on a fracking site. These could include water setback testing requirements, cement casing of well rules, fluid composition disclosures, water withdrawal process requirements, and the list kind of goes on and on and on. But not every state does it in the exact same way. It's important to note, you can have a New York that actually has a strict moratorium currently on the process. You could have a Colorado, which allows it but regulates it. Or you could have a California, which just recently passed SB4, that will heavily regulate it, but still allow it to go forth. So it's a very piecemeal process across the states. And that's really because the EPA has really kind of taken themselves out of the issue, either by legislative decision or by the EPA themselves deciding. And two of probably the biggest factors there are the 2005 Energy Policy Act, which exempted fracking from the Safe Drinking Water Act, and then a 1988 decision that the EPA decided not to classify any sort of fracking and oil gas production into the hazardous waste materials under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. The EPA is working on a few rules. They're particularly about pre-testing water wells and testing water sites that are expected to be released for review in 2014. So we'll see whether the federal government decides to jump in or not. But at this particular time, it really is a state-based level regulatory top-down regime.
Well, you probably are wondering what a couple of policy-oriented fellows at the Hoover Institution are doing talking about the science of this, and we probably are a bit out of our element. Any of you who've heard me speak before know that I love to wear hats when I speak, and so we're going to put our Hoover hats on now and talk a bit more about policy from a Hoover perspective. That perspective is one that looks at problems like this. By the way, you can pick these up over in 130 if you'd like. I like my collection of baseball caps. It's mostly because once I was out on the beach with my son when he was, I think, 10 years old, and I looked down at him and he wasn't wearing a hat. And I said, "What do you have for your head?" And he said, "Hair." So I always have mine handy because I don't. So what's our take on the policy? How have we been? How do we think a lot of these issues, local and water, especially issues, might be dealt with? And the answer is that environmental problems really occur because there have been some kind of violation of somebody else's property rights. If you dump your water and it ends up flowing into someone's well, that's a violation of the well owner's rights. And so we think it's important to focus on policy on who has what rights and who is violating someone else's rights. We also think that, and this is part of what I think Condi was emphasizing as well about just the importance of market systems as in a free society. But in this case, the market system can really help improve the environmental quality and help us ensure that the kind of problems that people are fretting about with respect to fracking are indeed rare. One of my main areas of writing has been on water markets, the potential to better allocate our water resources through the use of markets. In fact, one of my front row students here actually read one of my books entitled Tapping Water Markets, co-authored with two other young colleagues. And the notion of tapping water markets is that we now treat water as cheaper than dirt. It's virtually free. You may know what the price of gasoline is at the gas station, but you most likely haven't a clue what the price of the water is that comes out of your tap, even though it's a pretty valuable resource. In fact, the water in some places isn't even metered. You pay flat rates, so you don't even know how much you're consuming. Well, the use of water markets would greatly improve the efficiency with which we use the water, and given that as Carson points out, given that water is a pretty scarce resource in some parts of North Dakota and Texas, getting the allocation improved is an important part. And so some of the work we're doing now is looking at the potential for water markets to improve the allocation of water. It would make water supplies available for fracking if fracking is a high-valued use of water. It would also, if there were a price on the water, encourage those using the water in the fracking process to think about recycling. And indeed, there are places where a good deal of the water is recycled, sometimes not for potable water, but for other kinds of uses such as sewage and industrial uses. Water markets are a part of solving a lot of environmental problems, and we think they have an important role to play in the case of fracking. But it's only one element of what we've been thinking about, and so Carson and I spent some time together this summer focusing on other crucial ways of dealing with what George Mitchell, who's really the founder, in a sense, of fracking, points out that, if there is something wrong, we want to focus on that. And we think there's a better way than New York simply banning all fracking, or even than regulating it as heavily as California does. Carson will chat a bit about that.
Yeah, particularly for the water contamination and the seismic activity issues, we've been looking and exploring at alternatives to the top-down government regulatory regime. Is there a way that we can either replace it completely or lessen its impact by introducing some other sort of market-based regulatory power? And we've identified 3 possible areas where it could actually work, potentially. The first one is the insurance and surety bonding industries. The idea here is to essentially shift the financial risk associated with the fracking concerns to another fiduciarily responsible entity. And the insurance and surety bond industries are already operating within this space. And they would implicitly set standards or best practices by imposing appropriate premiums and risk interest rates. The fracking operators would essentially buy an insurance policy or be bonded. And then if a landowner or individual property owner is harmed either by seismic activity or water contamination, they can actually make a claim against that policy and or that bond. And this would actually expose a significant amount of risk to the insurance companies and the surety bonding companies, and therefore they would work very hard to lessen their exposure, to make sure that their payout does not exceed their premiums. Thereby, they would actually act as an outside regulatory agency in a way to the fracturing industry. Another idea we've been exploring is actually the idea of industry self-regulation. Self-regulation is something that isn't actually used on a widespread basis at this point. There is concern about the efficacy of self-regulation. However, it would be essentially forcing the fracturing operators and competitors to incentivize each other to use best practices in order to mitigate these water contamination and seismic activity concerns. Studies have shown that self-regulation is often best imposed when there is a great deal of threat of government intervention. And fracturing, again, as we've seen throughout the many states that it's been operating in, there is a high-level threat of government intervention because it's already occurring. And this would essentially, self-regulation would enable businesses to try to either prevent or lessen the impact of that self-regulation. A good example of this actually is the nuclear power industry. They, through the Institute for Nuclear Power Operators, the INPO, which was set up after the 1979 Three Mile Island incident, have designed a system whereby they can actually self-regulate themselves within the regulatory environment that has been imposed by them, by the federal government. And this organization sets performance objectives, criteria, and guidelines for the nuclear power industry. It regularly inspects the nuclear power plants and assists the plants in improving their operation performance. And over the years, the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and the INPO have actually formed a very strong working relationship, whereby the INPO actually goes into nuclear power plants in order to try to address, find, and then deal with any sort of possible incidents before the NRC actually has to come in and use their heavy hand. They often try to do. And then the third area is what I like to call corporate regulation or professional regulation. This is the idea of actually taking away the government agency completely and replacing it with an actual corporation. Something like this already exists with UL or Underwriters Limited that actually, if you look at it in your cell phones, electronics, anything like that, you'll see the UL symbol on the back. And it's a verification and certification company for consumer safety. But it already operates within the renewable energy industry as well as the environmental and other energy areas. And so if a company like UL were to develop, or even UL itself within the existing business model, could actually act as a certification and verification company to do all the things that the regulatory agency actually currently does. And all three of these would be theoretically a much more efficient way of actually trying to mitigate these concerns without actually having the heavy hand of a top-down government regulatory agency. However, the one problem here is that they all require clear fault. If your water is contaminated, if your house is damaged because of seismic activity, it's almost impossible to, at first glance, to be able to trace which well, which operator caused the contamination or caused the seismic activity. If you think back to the slide with for the Indian reservation, you saw how closely all those wells are clustered together. So this idea of determinable fault really comes into play. And up until recently, there really hasn't been a way to kind of fix this, hence the top-down government regulatory regime. However, because of scientific advances within this area of isotope tracers, which even right here not right here, but in the East Bay at the Lawrence National Laboratory, scientists have been using them to actually fingerprint the water so that they can study the flow patterns of water, the depths of water, and the behavior of water sources. That fingerprinting can actually be then used for the hydraulic fracturing fluid and to produce water as it comes back out of the well. And you can actually identify and trace back to each individual well or operator what the water source was. Hence, you can assign that determinable fault to the specific bad actor, allowing these three areas to actually become quite engaged in the regulatory process.
Well, I want to emphasize again that our goal is to think about the real environmental problems that might exist out there and find better ways of dealing with them. I should note that the Wall Street Journal had an article, I believe it was last weekend, Saturday's weekend journal, looking at the whole oil boom, and in part it interviewed corporate people who were saying, we really figured out what to do underground, but we haven't dealt very well with what goes on above ground. And I think that's a reflection of what we can expect from this industry as it expands and as it confronts the local problems that we've emphasized here. I want to close by talking a little bit about why we conclude that we should Fete over fracking. And part of it is that fracking has given us this huge supply of natural gas. And I'm not one who loses a lot of sleep over the issue of climate change or global warming, but environmentalists who do, such as my friend Fred Krupp, who's president of the Environmental Defense Fund, understands, as he puts it, gas is here to stay. And it's here to stay both because it's cheap, and if you're really concerned about putting carbon into the atmosphere, it's a lot better to use than coal and oil. And so a lot of power plants have shifted over to gas because it's now cheaper. It makes sense to retrofit plants that were coal burning or oil burning to use this cheaper natural gas. So it's really an important part, I think, of our future energy supplies and an important part of environmental concerns if indeed the climate change is one of those. But as Carson pointed out a bit ago, these risks are real, but we think they're rare. And they're so rare that we can indeed deal with them with a far less heavy-handed regulatory approach than we have, and allow us to have our cake and eat it too. I'd point out, for one thing, that when you think about the potential that we now have on land and compare it to what happened in the Gulf of Mexico with the deep water well, that if we have problems with the surface wells, even the deep surface wells like the fracking wells, they're much more easily dealt with. Again, I had a piece a couple of years ago in the Wall Street Journal while we were dealing with the Gulf of Mexico problem, there was a well in the Marsalis that actually had a leak. They had it fixed in 6 days, and it was a big leak, and that was a very uncommon experience. So all of this process, we think, has tremendous positive effects for the environment. Matt Ridley, who's spoken at one of these retreats in the past, a good friend who wrote a book called The Rational Optimist, said of global warming, I could not care less what the consensus is. It is the evidence that persuades me. And I think for us at Hoover, Hoover scholarship is about uncovering the evidence, knowing exactly what's real out there and what is hype. And Carson and I believe that when it comes to the fracking process, we should definitely stop fretting and start fetting. Thank you very much. We're happy to take some questions. Again,
This podcast has been a production of the Hoover Institution. Thank you for listening.